For the past several years, there's been a very unusual cross-country bike race in France that is exclusively for prisoners and their guards. The Penal Tour de France is a program that leaves many Americans scratching their heads. We think of jail time strictly as punishment, like societal revenge against those who have dared to commit crimes. In France, however, they do take a different perspective. In fact, it is illegal to schedule punitive treatment of prisoners because everyone who goes to prison has to have a treatment plan for recovery in order to become a useful and meaningful, productive member of French society. We like to beat down our inmates. We will not allow them to earn college degrees or even job certifications while they're in prison. We used to. But in the past generation, we've wanted to get tough on crime. And in that mentality of getting tough on crime, we don't want to give a prisoner an opportunity to gain job training that someone who hasn't committed a crime doesn't have access to. Now, you might think, shouldn't we make job training and education available to anyone that can't afford it? That, however, would be socialism. So we're not going to do that. Because the poor don't have access to education and job training, we also are not going to give it to people who are in prison. Now, if you agree with my often repeated insistence that the future of the church is entirely dependent upon our ability to become morally relevant institutions in society, I believe it's quite possible that one of the primary arenas that we're going to have to turn our attention to are the 2 million Americans who are currently in jail or prison. This hidden nation within our nation may need to have what we have to offer more than anyone else, and yet they are the least likely to come in contact with us. Now, admittedly, the prison system doesn't typically make it very easy on us. In the early 1990s, I tried repeatedly to set up credit college classes at the federal medical prison that's here in Springfield. Initially, I was told by the wardens that it would take too much staff time to move prisoners into a classroom and back. And once we had overcome that hurdle, then the rules around federal Pell Grants had changed and there were no tuition dollars available for prisoners. And the university I teach for wasn't interested in doing it without tuition dollars. Then I applied for clearance to teach basic self-help classes in our Greene County jail because I learned that we not only hold over prisoners for a brief time before they're arraigned in the county jail, but we have people in our county jail that have been there for more than 2 years without any meaningful programming. The day of my first class, I had my ID and clearance and background checks and books and pencils. The day of the first class, I was waiting in a holding area getting ready to teach when 2 guards that had just been hired that week evidently went on top of the gymnasium and urinated on prisoners that were playing basketball beneath. The warden decided that it was not in the jail's best interest to have outsiders having contact with potentially disgruntled prisoners who might complain. I think possibly my longtime role as an opinion writer for the Springfield News Leader may have increased their level of discomfort with how much they wanted me to know about what was going on inside their prison. But certainly they want to avoid the media learning anything about the level of abuse that was common in the jail. Far from the experience of a bicycle race in rural France, prisoners in our penal system experience violence, rape, and deprivations of every sort, and are often put into situations where the prisoners have to ask their family members to send them money to pay other prisoners for protection. That is, I will pay you to not beat me up or rape me. Once out of incarceration, the humiliations can multiply. With a criminal record, it's very difficult to find employment, and yet ex-cons are required to pay fees for their mandatory probation officer visits and follow-up supervision. The ex-con owes money to the state for having been imprisoned. Some even have to pay back their community prisons for the time that they were incarcerated. People on parole are making many of the annoying telemarketing calls that we receive because these commission sales jobs are one of the few places where they can find work. As infuriating as those telephone interruptions can be to us, can you imagine what it must be like after being in prison to come out and your job is to sit in a cubicle and take verbal abuse from total strangers all day long? Not that it's easy to garner sympathy for sex offenders, but may I remind you that nearly all sex offenders were offended as children themselves. They were victims. They are the most likely, however, to be mistreated when they are in prison, and the most likely to be reviled, unemployed, and homeless when they are out of prison. Most homeless shelters will not even give them temporary shelter, with no questions asked. If you appear on the sex offender list, you are not allowed inside the shelter. Permanently placed on a publicly available sex offender list, they often are not even allowed to live with family members because the family members would suffer abuse from their immediate neighbors. Though we cannot afford to be too lax about the threat posed by those who are likely to repeatedly reoffend, we also have to do something much better than what we're doing. If their offenses are not sufficient for society to justify killing them, then we have to find some way to let them live. Because reintegration into society has been made so very difficult, our recidivism rate in the United States is the worst in the world. This has been complicated by the fact that the one thing Americans have been really good at is finding a way to make a profit off of someone else's misery. Building prisons and operating them has become a huge profit center. So much so that some states have started privatizing their prisons so that every night an American is kept in jail is another opportunity to transfer tax money from citizens into the hands of corporations. When for-profit prisons are paid by volume, what possible motivation do they have to help prisoners to reform and to succeed outside of prison? In fact, recidivism fattens their profits, so they will do everything they can to prevent education, job training, counseling, or anything that might make a prisoner less likely to come back and bring them more tax dollars. Every nation has citizens who are entirely convinced that their homeland is the greatest country in the world. Americans have not only had a loudly stated conviction that ours is the greatest nation on the globe, but for much of our history, we've had the immigration statistics to back that up. However, our dramatically growing income disparity and class divisions threaten to destroy any plausibility of our claim that we're the greatest nation in the world. I'm going to discuss income disparity in my next chapter of my book in greater detail. But beyond the issue of the increasingly impassable gulf between the upper and lower classes that now keeps poor Americans forever poor, we have the former inmate, a growing subclass of our society for whom there is little opportunity for change and even less social sympathy. We are no longer world leaders in many categories, but in one way, we are unrivaled at the top of the list, but shamefully. We are at the top of the list for having the largest percentage of our population living behind bars. 7 out of every 1,000 Americans are currently incarcerated. China, long famous for their government's repression of their own citizens, has an incarceration rate that is less than 1/5 of ours, 20% of ours. Vietnam has an incarceration rate that's just 10% of our incarceration rate. How does this once great nation disown so many of its sons and daughters? It is in many ways a failure of our schools, a failure of our economic system. Arguably, it's a failure in families. It's certainly a failure of our judicial system. But you cannot avoid the fact that it's also an indictment of our churches. In the big picture, it's a failure of the society as a whole. We have too many drugs. We don't have enough decent jobs. There's too much violence, too many guns, not nearly enough love. We have too much moral judgment and not enough compassion. We are committed to revenge in our society. We are committed to revenge-style punishment, but we have nowhere near enough interest in reform, in re-education, in rehabilitation, in allowing a person to change and become fully human. The United States is one of the only countries in the world that allows for a huge disparity in education spending based on school districts, which allows affluent neighborhoods to have great schools and poor regions to have poor schools that are ill-equipped, underfunded, and understaffed. Anyone can see that logically it should be the other way around. The children of the poor need more enrichment in education than their middle and upper class peers whose families can well afford the kind of travel and cultural experiences that give their kids a leg up in life. We have created a broken school system and a for-profit prison system that work together to fast-track kids from poor neighborhoods into bad schools and straight into prison. A situation that is tragically complicated by race. Even though blacks and whites use drugs at the same rate, blacks are 3 times more likely to go to jail for their drug offenses than are whites. Some of that is simple racism, but a lot of it is an indication of just how corrupt our judicial system has become. We have prided ourselves on the strength of the belief that our constitutional government creates equality in our nation. Our courthouses are adorned with statues of Lady Liberty, blindfolded, holding out the scales, saying that justice is dispensed without regard to race or class or gender. But folks, don't believe it. Our judicial system doesn't come close to those high-minded ideals. Howard Zinn said that our judicial system doesn't decide who's right and who's wrong, it decides who can pay their attorney the most. Far too little of our justice system is engaged in the pursuit of justice, and much too much of it is an institution that serves the interest of the income of the lawyers and the profit of corporations. If I were sitting out there, I'd say amen. I don't know. It's just me. I'm just saying. Are you all scared, or did you quit listening? Okay, all right. There is one judicial system for wealthy people. There's another judicial system for the poor. And in my experience, there's even a third judicial system that serves legal professionals for their own issues, giving lawyers a literal court system that serves only their fraternity and sorority. There could not be in any third world country more personal favors, more disappeared traffic tickets, and inexplicably favorable rulings based on kinship and friendship and law firm partnership than we have allowed to come into existence in our legal system. All right. Somehow over the past half century, the laudable war on poverty evolved into a war on drugs. We were making progress in the war on poverty. We don't talk about it often enough, but when President Johnson set out to substantively change the face of poverty in America, those programs were working. But as the movement became focused on drug abuse and our resources got reassigned, devoted to arresting and imprisoning drug users, the earlier progress was lost, and now we're doing something much, much more insidious. Technological advances, as well as the deportation of our manufacturing jobs, have left us in possession of a surplus workforce. We are removing many of the extra laborers from the labor pool by putting 2 million of them in prison and leaving millions more with a criminal record that just takes them out of competition for a decent job. It is no exaggeration then to say that our nation is in need of a spiritual revival. Religious people must convincingly teach the message of compassion to our society that has far too often chosen profit over people. We have continued to pour resources into the complete failure of the war on drugs. that could have been used to build up our schools, to fund public infrastructure projects that could meaningfully pull the United States into the 21st century. Western European countries that have almost no church attendance compared to the United States also enjoy an incarceration rate that is less than 1/4 of ours. Why would a nation with the most churches also have the most prisons? I cannot help thinking that traditional religion has played a role in teaching people to deny reality, to disregard the aspects of our real society that are seriously broken, by focusing on a perfection that will exist only after death in heaven, that distracts us from the real world where we actually live and could do something better. The progressive church has a mission to tell the truth, to shine the light of facts and reality into the dark places of insidious mythology and superstition. If we are a prophetic church, then we must stand up to things like income inequality, unequal public schools, joblessness, and a senseless devotion to energy sources that are destroying the planet and transportation technology that, again, divides the classes while destroying the planet, and a foreign policy based on war that hasn't worked for 60 years. We can employ more people by rebuilding our infrastructure, renewing our power grid, building alternative energy production facilities, and mass transit. We can decide to fund our public schools, make it possible for the poor to attend college, and make prisons places of healing and learning rather than places of rape, torture, and training in how they can be a better criminal next time. We can decriminalize addiction and assume that anyone who says that they need a prescription for medical marijuana to cope with how crazy this country has become probably deserves it, but they certainly don't deserve to be put in jail. A society that is bent on revenge is a sick society. A society that is intent on healing and forgiveness and compassion and peace. Oh, that's a nation that I would call the greatest nation in the world.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.